Good afternoon. My name is Ron Hassner. I'm a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and co-director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. And I'd like to welcome you all to a brief conversation about the current crisis in Israel with Chuck Freilich, who is live with us from Israel. Hi, Chuck.
Hi there.
Chuck Freilich is former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel and a longtime senior fellow both at Harvard's Belfer Center, also teaches political science at Columbia University, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. His books include Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy, that came out with Cornell in 2012. Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change, that came out with Oxford in 2018. And Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power, that is forthcoming in 2021, so later this year. Chuck has published numerous academic articles and over 170 op-eds. He appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. And I'm delighted to have you here, Chuck, especially on such short notice, so welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and also thanks to Udi Iran, my good friend, for suggesting this. The truth is, when you have somebody like Udi, you don't need anyone else, but
that's right.
I'm happy to be here anyway.
That's right. Professor Iran finished teaching a class on Israel's national security strategy for the Diller Institute at Berkeley last fall. So, Chuck, before I get going, let me do some housekeeping. First of all, remind everyone this conversation will last about an hour. There is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you, dear audience members, would like to ask a question, please write it into your Q&A and we will then direct it at Chuck. The focus of our conversation could have been many. We could have talked about the next Israeli government. We could have talked about the broader peace accords that Israel is part of, or Arab-Israeli relations. Chuck, both you and I are national security scholars, so I think we should focus our conversation on that and talk primarily about the conflict itself, if that's okay with you. To start off, you are in Israel, Chuck. How are you doing? How's your family doing? What has the last week been like?
Well, first of all, there are attacks underway as we speak. The people in the southern part of Israel are, I imagine, all in their shelters at the moment, and there are literally attacks going on as we speak. And the assumption is that tonight may be a very bad night because there is talk of a ceasefire in the next day or two. I'm not sure that it's going to happen, but Hamas wants to go out with a bang. I live just a few minutes outside, a few minutes north of Tel Aviv. We have had only about 7 or maybe 8 alerts since it started, a few were at night. We have the good fortune of having a shelter right in our apartment. Every apartment built in Israel since the 1980s has a shelter in it. It's usually one of the bedrooms, reinforced concrete walls. So for us, it's really just a matter of walking a few feet, closing the heavy metal door. And to be honest, it's not that bad. But for the people who live closer to the Gaza area, people who live in the cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon, the last week has been a nightmare. It's actually years of a nightmare, not quite as bad as this. Running to shelters all the time. And not everyone, as a matter of fact, most of the public doesn't have a shelter in their home. A lot of people don't even have it in their building. And then they have to go running to the nearest public shelter, which sometimes is not so near. So as I said, I've got a shelter right in my apartment. My daughter lives in Tel Aviv in a building. She does not have one in her apartment, so she has to run down a few floors in the middle of the night. They do have one in the building.
Yeah, that sounds tough. So can you put this conflict that began a week ago in a broader context of other crises that Israel is dealing with on multiple fronts, as I read the news?
I think Israel at the moment faces just about a perfect storm. It's hard to imagine that things could be a lot worse, but they could because Hezbollah could join in. But we are in the midst of an ongoing political, legal crisis, which is the worst in the history of the nation. 4 elections in 2 years, and a good likelihood that a 5th round will be held just a few months from now. We have a prime minister who I believe is willing to go to all lengths and take the state of Israel down with him in the attempt to stay out of jail. Now, on a personal level, of course, I understand him. Nobody wants to go to jail, but I think he is causing irreparable harm, or harm that it will take a long time to repair to Israel's legal system, its democratic system. That, in many ways, is the issue that worries me the most. We still have the effects of the COVID crisis, where the prime minister absolutely dropped the ball for a year, and then, to his credit, launched a remarkable drive for the vaccination program. He gets a lot of credit for that. We're in the midst of what may be the worst economic crisis because of the COVID crisis. And there is a severe loss of faith in government, the delegitimization of the system. The ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi, and the Arab populations have been out of control for the last year and recently. And now we've had this horrific violence between Jews and Arabs in Israel. I am deeply concerned that Israel is approaching a point of anarchy. Then we have, of course, this Gaza crisis. And in the background, let's not forget Iran and their nuclear program.
Yeah, so that's significant grounds for pessimism. Let me ask a careful question here about how to evaluate this particular conflict here. I have two evaluative questions, and I'll ask them in order, and they're echoing some of the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A. How will Israel, when this is over, and how will Hamas, when this is over, decide for themselves whether if they've done the best they could in this conflict, whether they came out ahead, or whether they did not do so well. Obviously, in public, both sides will claim tremendous success. We liberated Jerusalem, whatever. But how would one, as a scholar of national security, studying this conflict from afar, assess the costs and benefits of this crisis in terms of Hamas's ability to further control the Gaza Strip, or Israel's ability to mitigate the Hamas threat?
First of all, I think Hamas achieved most of their strategic objectives the first couple of days of the war. Now, there were lots of things that led to the outbreak, and I think Israel was partly responsible for some of them. At a bare minimum, there were certain events that were mishandled or could have been handled differently and contributed then to the overall atmosphere in which this broke out. But it broke out, I believe, because Hamas, which was counting on the Palestinian elections that President Abbas had announced and then canceled, that dashed their hopes. This is a multi-year hope, but now it was very practical, it was imminent, that they were going to be able to take over the Palestinian arena completely from within through the mechanism of the elections. And so he dashed that hope. And they were looking for a way, an alternative way to gain leadership, to take control or leadership of the Palestinian arena. And this conflict is the way to do it. And they also linked it to the Jerusalem issue. And Jerusalem, of course, is the ultimate sensitive issue. So I think they've done very well from that point of view. They also demonstrated military capabilities that went beyond what we thought they had, not just in the quantity. I don't think there was a big surprise in terms of the quantity of what they have and what they have, but in terms of their ability to use it effectively, to fire massive barrages. In the past, they did a few, they did 5, 10. Now we've had barrages of 200. So I think Hamas has done a good job from their point of view. And the fact that the Gaza Strip gets hit very, very hard, I don't want to say it's of no concern to them, but it's a secondary concern to them. They're not that concerned about human loss of lives. Israel, I think, demonstrated that our military capabilities, and especially those developed for scenarios like this, have improved greatly. The Air Force has done in a week more than I think it did in the last conflict in 50 days. The destruction of something like 100 miles out of the few hundred miles of the underground tunnel network is really a phenomenal achievement. But these are tactical achievements, not strategic. I don't think we've achieved anything strategically as this.
What would a strategic achievement be, Chuck? What would amount to a strategic success?
Well, the strategic goal that was set by the government was a kind of amorphous one, which is to strengthen deterrence and regain a period of calm, hopefully more prolonged than in the past. That's a kind of minimalist strategic objective for me. A strategic objective would have been to change the situation in some basic, maybe even fundamental manner. If, and I'm not recommending this, but if Israel, for example, wanted to topple Hamas and see if some other better government could be installed there. If Israel was willing to reoccupy Gaza, which I certainly don't think we should be doing. The alternative, of course, was this supposed to be, or did Israel want this to be, the basis for an opening to a renewed peace process? And now we're going to go back towards working with Mr. Abbas, with the Palestinian Authority, where the Netanyahu government's policy for the last dozen years has been to perpetuate the separation between the West Bank and Gaza. Israel didn't cause it, and it's there regardless of what we do, but we did our best to perpetuate the situation, actually keep Hamas in power. We wanted them weakened, but we wanted them in power because the governments we've had for the last decade have not wanted to go ahead on a peace process with the PA. I'm not at all convinced that there's a peace process to be had, but this was a way of making sure it didn't happen. So I don't think we've achieved any strategic achievements here. And the biggest casualty of this conflict from Israel's point of view may be our relationship with the United States. And that, to my way of thinking, is horrific. It's mind-boggling.
I'll ask you about that in a question in a minute. Let me ask my second question, which is sort of a question of evaluating the tactics and the strategy. How does one, when one studies counterinsurgencies like these, so asymmetric conflict in which one side tries to target militants and the other side tries to target civilians, how do you evaluate in a conflict like that restraint? How do you decide from an objective point of view whether Israel has taken reasonable, excessive, unreasonable efforts to discriminate between civilians and Hamas members? Certainly, you can't just count because the count will always very clearly show that Israel's doing a better job protecting Israelis than Hamas is doing protecting Palestinians. But how do you evaluate whether the Israeli military has done its due diligence in terms of proportionality? Could Israel have done better? Should it have done better?
Look, you can always say do better because the horrors of war are such that people will always get killed no matter what you do. And in this case, we have an adversary that intentionally targets civilians. That's its entire strategy. And it intentionally places its own weapons in the most sensitive civilian areas. So it doesn't matter, how careful Israel will be, there will always be civilian casualties. I think Israel does a remarkable job, an incredible job, which we don't get credit for. Now, that doesn't mean that civilians don't get killed, and it's a horror, and we regret every one, as opposed to Hamas, which that's all they want to do is kill civilians. There was, after the 2014 conflict, which was the last big one, an international team of military experts, included a former American Secretary of Defense, Chairman of Joint Chiefs, the British Permanent Secretary of the Department of the Ministry of Defense, from France, leading defense officials from around the world. They came out with a critical report of Israel because they said that Israel set a bar that no other military could achieve in terms of preventing civilian losses. And I think we've gotten even better at doing it this time. Now, people talk about this idea of proportionality, and I think it's an easy concept, or it's an easy word. Oh, proportionality. And people have come to think that war is supposed to be balanced and equal. You want to have even sides. Well, first of all, that's not what war is about. War is about trying to bring preponderant force to bear, but that's also not what proportionality means under international law. What proportionality means is not that you can't kill civilians. Obviously, you shouldn't. It doesn't mean that you have to use equal force. It means that the force that is applied should be proportionate to what a reasonable military commander in the field would use in order to achieve the objective that he was given. And that it can't be indiscriminate. That's what proportionality is. So when Israel brings disproportionate power to bear, that's what military conflict is about. That's how you win. And the key is not to kill civilians. I'm horrified by all the talk of, which is in essence, moral equivalence. Again, we have a terrorist organization, which is defined as such, not by me, but by the United States, the European Union, and the Arab League, which intentionally tries to kill civilians, as many as they can. What do the critics expect? I mean, yeah, sure. And for example, there's an asymmetry in casualties. So should we go and turn Iron Dome off so a few hundred Israelis or more are killed, and then there'll be a more equal number and everybody will be happy? Well, sorry, no, we have no intention of doing that.
So as a lay onlooker observes this conflict, what indicators are there that Israel is showing restraint, that Israel is being discriminate? Or how can you tell that Israel is not being restrained and discriminate? What sort of tactical moves should one pay attention to as one's trying to decide, for example, how is Israel conducting itself here versus how the United States conducted itself in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Infinitely more carefully.
How do you know? What do you look at?
First of all, you look at the number of casualties, which is, look, every person killed is one too many, okay? But we're now talking somewhere just over 200 people on the Palestinian side. This is one of the densest places on earth. People live right next to the rockets. The number is actually, first of all, it's a fraction of the previous conflicts. It's not a big number in and of itself. Horrors happen here, but look at the tactics. Warning is given before Israel attacks sites where civilians might be located. Okay, there was a lot of criticism of the attack on the building with Al Jazeera and AP. First of all, the criticism, they knew who their neighbors were. Okay, they are simply lying through their teeth when they say that they didn't know. They were warned many times in the past. As a matter of fact, this building was attacked in the past because of them. Hamas had its R&D offices there. They had some sort of intelligence unit. This is where they were blocking GPS signals, trying to block Israeli GPS signals. We know what they're doing. And if you look at the IDF's attacks, this is as surgical as it gets. Does somebody want to come along and say, well, there was this attack or that attack which could have been done better? I am absolutely sure that's the case. Military conflict is not a 100% perfect science, but there's no doubt that there is a 100% effort here.
I've had many questions, especially from students in recent days, and I'm seeing this also in the Q&A. Several students are asking about how that campaign is being waged in the media and on social media. Is Israel not interested in providing information that sort of showcases its motivations, its discrimination? For example, information that it had about these Hamas offices. Does it not want to share that information, or it just tries to share it, but it doesn't do a very good job at it? It's a little puzzling.
The information about that building was shared with the U.S., with the government. It's classified information, I imagine highly classified. I would have hoped that the government would have found a way to declassify at least some of it, because if you look at the one issue, the one attack that created the greatest controversy, it was that one. So I think we should do a better job there. I think there's a problem here of, there's been a change in norms in the United States in recent years. And it's very, very hard to fight this tide. For example, I saw a Twitter post today, Black Lives Matter movement totally supporting the Palestinians. With all due respect, there is no similarity between the Black Lives movement and Hamas, none. But for the American left, especially the more progressive left, they, I think, have, I don't even know what to call it. There's been a change in values, which I personally deplore. None of us want to see people killed. This conflict has been going on for a very long time. If people want to come and say, well, we need a peace process, I couldn't agree more. And if you want to talk about the peace process, I'm an ardent supporter of the two-state solution. But that's not what this is about. This is about people firing rockets at the other side. And if people want the rocket fire to end, it's very simple. Or the war to end, it's very simple. Hamas has to stop firing. Israel doesn't fire at them when they don't fire at us. We know which side does the firing. Now, is Israel 100% in the right in the overall conflict? Of course not. But
I have yet another evaluative sort of national security question that has to do with Iron Dome, and I don't know how openly you want to talk about that or how much you can share. But how do I evaluate the abilities of Iron Dome and the capabilities of Hamas in terms of rockets? Is Hamas rocket fire declining now because they are running out of rockets, or because they are hinting at a desire for ceasefire? Was there, as I read it, an attempt to overwhelm Iron Dome that failed? What have we learned about rocket and anti-rocket technology in the last week?
I think Iron Dome is proven to be, once again, one of the more remarkable weapon systems ever developed. It's continuing to have about a 90% intercept rate. The problem is that, well, when they were firing a half a dozen rockets, 10 rockets, and you were 90% effective, okay, so maybe occasionally one got through. When there's firing salvos of 100, 200 and more, 10% get through. Well, a lot of them fortunately fall in open spaces, but some of them hit. And so we've already had a dozen Israeli fatalities and a few hundred people wounded. It's remarkably effective. The rate of fire has not diminished. Yesterday and today, I believe they set the total records since this round began 10 days ago. They still have, look, they started this somewhere between 20 and 30,000 rockets, probably closer to the higher number. And the last figure I saw, which is a day or two old, was that they had fired 3,100. So it's another few hundred, let's say somewhere around 3,500. They still have lots. I'm wondering if they've used up a large part of their long-range arsenal, because areas north of Tel Aviv have not seen too much the last few days, but they may just be saving that for the final part of this. Don't
And
know.
those longer range rockets are supplied in part by Iran. Several of our audience members want to know what Iran's role is in this and why we haven't seen Hezbollah use this as an opportunity to launch a second front.
Iran supplies most of the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, with rockets, and they've been very active in this conflict. They were not that active in the past. They didn't have the capabilities. Now they do. And some supplied to Hamas, probably more in terms of technology than actual rockets. Most of what Hamas has is self-produced. In terms of Hezbollah, that's not just a good question, but that's almost $1 million question. Why haven't they gotten in yet, or whether they might? And today, a few rockets were fired from Lebanon. I think that's the third time, or maybe the fourth, that a few rockets were fired. It seems to be from Palestinian organizations in Lebanon, not from Hezbollah. Why are they staying out? I think they are still deterred from the 2006 conflict, the so-called Second Lebanon War. If you remember, Israel ended that round feeling that this was not a big success, that we had actually screwed things up on a military level in just about every way possible. The prime minister, chief of staff, and minister of defense all either resigned or were forced out by a commission of national inquiry within about 1.5 years of the war. In retrospect, Israel achieved a great deal of deterrence. We're now 15 years later. The thought was that Hamas, which had been hit very hard, or Gaza had been hit very hard in the previous rounds, that this was beginning to be something like Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was clear that the deterrence wasn't that great, but we thought that we were gradually building deterrence towards Hamas, that Hamas had been hit, Gaza had been hit so hard that they didn't want to get into this again. I think we underestimated that.
Do you think there is a scenario in which, in the absence of a ceasefire, this spirals further out of control and draws either Hezbollah further in or West Bank violence?
We've already seen a fair amount of violence on the West Bank. That's a definite possibility. And yeah, Hezbollah could still get in. I would say in a couple of scenarios. One is if all of a sudden Hamas seems to be doing really well and they want to join in the bandwagon and join in the glory. Conversely, if we do reach some sort of a tipping point, which I don't think is going to happen, but that could be another scenario. If Iran comes to the conclusion that it serves their purposes, I don't think so. I think Iran built up Hezbollah, and it's an Iranian proxy. It's funded, trained, armed by Hezbollah, by Iran. Iran gave it something like 150,000 rockets that they have. I think that is Iran's, if I can call it, doomsday option. They want this phenomenal ability right on Israel's border, which will make what's happening with Hamas now look like a joke in comparison. That is for the scenario if Israel or the US ever attacks their nuclear program. I don't think they want to risk that before then.
That's interesting. That's interesting. A dear colleague of mine in the political science department is asking for a little more information about sort of how the Hamas organizational network fits physically into the Gaza Strip. Are they headquartered in a particular part of the Gaza Strip? Do these tunnels that Israel is bombing, do those run under residential neighborhoods? Do they run on the margins of the Gaza Strip? Where are the rockets kept? Where are the decisions made?
They've decentralized everything as a conclusion, a lesson that they learned from the previous rounds. Not to put everything in one place, whether it's the rockets, or other military capabilities, or the leadership, civilian and military. They try and decentralize and spread everything around Gaza. The tunnels run for hundreds of miles. Hundreds of miles. It's mind-boggling. That's where at least a lot of the leadership, military and civilian, are holed up. That's where a lot of the rockets are. Some of the, or a large part of the rockets are actually in pre-dug positions all they have to do is come in and press the remote control, and the thing is fired. So it's really hard for Israel to find that. The longer range ones and the multi-launcher ones, which are bigger, are more easily found. Also not easy, but more easily found. So Israel's had an easier job targeting them. The tunnels run all over Gaza. Yes, of course, under civilian neighborhoods. You can't have hundreds of miles of tunnels in a place like Gaza without, by definition,
So why are we seeing both?
crisscrossing the
Yeah,
city.
sorry, you cut off there for a second. Why are we seeing reports? I don't know how reliable they are of hospitals, of infrastructure getting hit, of sewage being damaged, of food supplies and water supply into Gaza? Are those being targeted intentionally, in part in order to cause some sort of I don't know, moral effect?
I think I already answered that question. It is pure nonsense. Hamas likes to play that game. There will always be reports of horrors, of hospitals, of this, that. By the way, I mean, if you put your rockets right next to hospitals, hospitals may get hit. The IDF has, the Air Force in this case, well, both the regular IDF and the Air Force, have an incredible targeting process. Every target is weighed in 100 different ways in terms of its importance. Do we really have to hit this? When should we hit it? How should we hit it? And especially, what are the ramifications all around? Again, in military conflict, zero errors, of course not. But people who talk about Israel doing this intentionally, they're simply playing into Hamas's game. Do not be duped by things like that. They do this every conflict. Israel can be criticized for lots of other things, and we have the occasion for another talk. I'll be more than happy to do that.
Speaking of which, you alluded at the beginning, Israel's responsibility for the inflaming of tensions about a week ago. You already provided what I think is a very reasonable answer for the broader setting. Political instability in Israel, canceled elections in the Palestinian territories. But in terms of the sort of more immediate causes of the conflict, to what extent was Israel unwise in escalating this, and to what extent was this pre-planned? Could this have been avoided?
Israel didn't start this, by the way. Not the Hamas part of it, the rocket part of it. Israel can be criticized for how it handled the riots on the Temple Mount in the mosque, how the young Palestinians who gather outside the I think it's the Damascus Gate. That there's plenty of room for criticism there. You could say there was room for criticism certainly over the potential evictions. But that was coming to the Supreme Court, by the way. People might have waited till the court handed down its decision before deciding to start this. This was something, Israel didn't start this. This was, I said before, this was a Hamas decision because they were trying, there must be a siren nearby, but it's not here. Hamas they needed this as a way to reassert their position in the Palestinian arena and maybe to take over. Where things start getting iffier is, for example, did the prime minister knowingly let the police overreact on the Temple Mount? So was it a failure of omission? Was it a failure of commission? Not a failure, an act of commission. I think it is hard to imagine that he didn't take advantage of some of these events to help create what Hamas was doing in any event, which was leading to the outbreak of the military conflict. It
To what,
serves.
to what extent does this play into Netanyahu's hand, and to what extent is it a problem for him?
No, well, it depends how it ends, but it's basically, I think, a big gain for him. First of all, he used it to dismantle the new alternative government that was hours from being sworn in. It's something like what he did to Gantz, to the Blue-White Party a year ago. He did the same thing. He somehow caused Naftali Bennett to break at the last minute. And so he dismantled that. And you can make the argument, some people are, we'll see if it works out this way or not, that this conflict won't end until Lapid's, the period that he has for forming a new government ends, which is about another 10 days from now, something like that. I'd be surprised if it goes that long, but maybe. I mean, it serves Bibi's purposes for staying in office. Nothing like a military crisis, a genuine military crisis, Israeli cities being attacked, to get people to rally around the flag and around his leadership. He's always been good at that. There's no evidence that he intentionally caused any of this. I think one would have to be naive not to believe that he didn't maybe agree to ignore some police overreacting or not deal with some things because he understood that it would serve his purposes.
Two of our students are asking about the U.S. role in soothing this crisis, but they're asking opposite questions. One was wondering to what extent Biden sitting in the White House made the crisis possible, and another is wondering to what extent Biden might now intervene and ease tensions.
I think there's a natural tendency when you grow up in a global superpower, especially the United States, to believe that the US is involved in everything and can affect everything, and that's not the case. First of all, the US has retrenched from the Middle East greatly in recent years. It doesn't have the assets and influence that it had in the region. And this is a case where it has limited options and influence. I mean, it has almost no influence over Hamas. It's a terrorist organization, which the US refuses to talk to correctly. Almost no leverage over them. Of course, it has more leverage over Israel, but it hasn't wanted to use that leverage because Israel was under attack. And so you saw the president coming out and saying very strongly, when Israel's under attack from Hamas, then the United States must support it. Now, what we also see that we haven't seen in the past is the rise of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and calls even not just for a ceasefire, and of course there'll be a ceasefire. The only question is when. From an Israeli perspective, we didn't want it to be premature. How do you define premature? I can say that I made, I think, an error here because I was saying that Israel should have shut this down probably last Saturday, that we had done what we could have done militarily. There were some important achievements. Time to end it for diplomatic or political reasons. Well, then the next night, I think it was Saturday night, I could be off by a day, the IDF launched another attack against the tunnel system. And so I think, for example, I was a day or two early there, and maybe there are more military details. I'm no longer privileged to classified information. So I don't know exactly the day that this should be ended. Now the president, partly because this has to end and partly because he is subject to a lot of pressure from within the party, is trying to at least get Israel to put an end to it, which doesn't guarantee. Israel can announce a unilateral ceasefire tomorrow or to this minute. Israel did that in previous rounds and Hamas didn't respond. It continued firing. But there's no moral equivalence here. And I think people have to keep that in mind.
How do you alluded to the effects that this might have on the U.S. public, on the Jewish community in the United States, and the role that the U.S. public plays? Do you want to say more about that? Because it's reflected in some of the questions we're getting as well. In part, people are asking outright, how can they do a better job explaining this? What resources could they point to, or understanding it?
Well, I mean, I would hope that this conversation helped a little, and there are lots more. And there's lots of information out there to read. I think the New York Times and Washington Post have simply become propaganda sheets. And people who haven't heard me speak before, I'm usually very open and very critical of our policies. This is not objective reporting. This is media murder. And I say that really, I mean, it's a strong term, and I don't usually speak in those terms. Wall Street Journal has been much more balanced here. There are lots of other sources if people want to read things. Just by the way, some of the Israeli press, Haaretz, is not very balanced either. I think there's a lot of criticism in the Jewish community. Some of it, of course, is legitimate, and I share a lot of it. But I think people are very, very quick to criticize. They have very strong opinions. They usually know very, very little, including many Jewish Americans who think they know something about the conflict. They rarely do. What I've heard in recent years, way before this conflict, including from leading American Jews, leading public figures, saying, oh, this isn't the Israel that I believed in. I'm disaffected, I'm alienated, I'm distancing myself from Israel. Now, I understand the feelings. I share a lot of them. The Israel that I live in is not the Israel that I had hoped to live in when they made Aliyah 52 years ago. It's the Israel that exists. I don't normally quote Bibi, but we never promised you a Jewish rose garden. This is the Jewish reality today. I think people who distance themselves, who are alienated from Israel, 73 years after Israel's establishment, 76 years after the Holocaust was ended, I have an impolite suggestion for what people like that might want to do. Let me just add one more thing if I can, Ron.
Sure.
People want to see a change in Israeli policy. Okay, I happen to share a lot of that. The place to do it is in Israel. It's not in the United States. It's certainly not in Washington, D.C. Lobbying the administration against the government of Israel, as much as you may not like this government, I don't, not the place to do it. The place to fight this war is in Israel. Now, okay, so Jewish Americans can't fight that war directly, but they can indirectly, and that's by supporting lots of good organizations in Israel, educational programs in Israel, even supporting political parties, which is something which in the past I said, no way, people should stay out of that. This is Israel. Well, the right is doing it. They've been doing it for decades. Maybe it's time for more centrist people to start doing things like that. And a final word on this, there are calls now. I believe a bill was just submitted today in Congress, but we saw Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, other prominent people from the progressive wing calling for American military aid to Israel to be conditioned on a change in Israel's policy. I find that both immoral and strategically unwise. That's not the way you handle things like this. Military aid was the bedrock of the US-Israeli relationship. Until today, it was holy. And the fact that people are talking about this today, including in the Jewish community, I find horrifying and inexcusable. We still have an Iranian nuclear threat. We've got Hezbollah, and Hamas is bad enough. We have a state to continue defending. It may not be perfect. It isn't. And we have to make a lot of changes, but not by risking its existence.
So you outlined what U.S. viewers can do to exert more constructive pressure on Israel. What can Palestinians do? And this is a question coming from one of our undergraduate fellows that works closely with the Institute. What can Palestinians do to exert pressure both on Israel and on their own leadership, short of violence? So to pacify those who claim that the Palestinians are resorting to violence because it is the only tool at their disposal to bring Israel to the negotiation table. What other tools are available to Palestinians in order to accomplish their goal of statehood?
The Palestinians have rejected 3 dramatic peace proposals, 2 in 2000 and 1 in 2008, which would have given them 100%, a state on 100% of Gaza, on just about 100% of the West Bank, and a division of Jerusalem, including sovereignty over the mosque, or at least control over the mosque. In effect, they were given almost 100% of their demands, except on the refugee issue. And I don't believe that Israel will ever compromise significantly on that issue. There's a left to right consensus on that. The Palestinians have to come to terms with that. They have to come to terms with the fact that Israel is here to stay. And unfortunately, 73 years later, there is still a significant portion of the Palestinian population which has not yet internalized that. So one of the things, and by the way, I'm not putting all the blame on the Palestinian side. For the last dozen years, we've had governments in Israel that have also not been willing to make the concessions. But the Palestinians could have had a state on 3 occasions, and they rejected a really phenomenal set of offers. So one thing is learning to say yes for what is less than 100% of your demands. That's one thing. That would put the Israeli government under pressure. If all of a sudden it turned out there really was a Palestinian interlocutor. The second thing is actually there is something non-violent that the Palestinians could do. I don't want to give the other side any good ideas, but it's not an original one. How about non-violent protests? The first Intifada was violent. The second one was extraordinarily violent. How about trying some real non-violent protest? How about a march on Jerusalem? Whatever. Lots of variety.
And what is it that the Israeli government could do, probably not this government, but a future government could do to signal its interest in accommodation, 2-state solution, compromise? Because I think I agree with you, and most everybody who's understands Middle East history and Middle East politics understands that a 1-state solution is a chimera, is nonsense. So since the 2-state solution is the only real option available, what does the next Israeli government need to do in order to make that more viable?
Well, first of all, we have to start talking again about a 2-state solution. And we have to stop doing acts which, by our own hand, make the ability to go to a 2-state solution that much harder. And I'm talking about settling in the heart of the West Bank. Settlements, by the way, settling right on the border, the areas which will presumably remain, even the Palestinians recognize, will remain part of Israel in a future settlement. And that's where most of the settlers are and most of the settling is. That isn't the problem. But the settlements outside that area, deep in the West Bank, this is national lunacy. If we want to be a predominantly Jewish and a vibrant democracy, we're shooting ourselves in our feet. I don't understand how that happens. So that has to happen. That has to change. We have to start trying to work much better, much more closely with Mr. Abbas while he's still around. He's getting on in years, and with a future successor. We have to try and help build the stature of moderate future successors. We can't directly intervene in Palestinian politics. It wouldn't work and it would be counterproductive, but we can help strengthen the moderate players. We keep negotiating with Hamas in each of these rounds, not directly, but through third parties. Hamas keeps collecting more and more achievements over time, and the PA is shunted aside further and further, and Abbas looks weaker and weaker and less relevant. We have to rebuild his stature. There are various goodwill measures that could be taken. Everybody always wants Israel to do goodwill measures. We can do some more. The Palestinians also have to do some. Look, in the end, there are 2 or 3 issues that are the make or break ones. I said, I think for the Palestinians, the number one make or break issue is the ability to realize that there will not be what they call a right of return. It's not going to happen. Israel has to recognize that it is not going to keep all of the territory, and we're probably going to have to make a significant compromise on Jerusalem. And for the Jewish people, after 2,000 years, and Jerusalem is our only holy city. For the Muslims, it's the third holy, and I don't care, first, third, this isn't math, but people have to say, for us, this is it. And 90-odd% of the Israeli public today not willing to compromise on Jerusalem. Well, I think we are going to have to. The Palestinians are going to have to recognize that they're going to get less than they want in Jerusalem. These are the really make or break issues. And there's lots more of the security. Turns out the security issues, the territorial issues aren't as easy as some people thought. We have to get back to the talks. And I couldn't agree with you more that the talk of one state solution is simply nonsense. It will never happen. And people who raise it are just blowing smoke to divert attention from the real thing.
Several people have asked what role neighboring countries can play, especially in light of the new relationship that Israel has with Morocco and with some of the Gulf states. Do you see those players performing a positive, constructive role, or on the other hand, do you see the conflict undermining the relationships that Israel has?
Well, I'm deeply afraid that it may undermine the relationship. What's happening with the UAE is really remarkable. Bahrain a little bit less, but they're both going ahead very rapidly, and UAE above and beyond anything that we could have expected. And I hope that this doesn't hurt that too much.
I'm sorry, what do you mean? What is above and beyond?
The areas of cooperation that have already begun in all sorts of areas. I mean, it's just remarkable. In what is it, about 8 months since the agreement was signed, and Bahrain it's even less. For those who know the Hebrew expression kol hakavod, I mean, they are really. This is above and beyond what we could have expected, and any damage to that relationship will be bad. Some people talk about the fact that, well, these agreements were signed, but they did nothing for the Palestinians. That's true. That's unfortunate. But not everything in life or everything about Israel has to do with the Palestinians. These agreements were a remarkable historic achievement in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, in the history of the Middle East, on their own legs. I think in the longer term, they can play a positive role in terms of the Palestinians also. First of all, there's a decrease in the overall level of conflict, a major decrease in the level of conflict between Israel and the Arab world. Israel will take into account their positions. It will have some sort of moderating effect, maybe not major, but it'll have some effect. And if and when progress really can be made, I believe that they will be able to offer the Palestinians all sorts of carrots to help implement a peace agreement, and provide them incentives for a peace agreement if the Palestinians want it.
In the absence of a significant role for the United States, I'm gathering that Egypt is now playing the primary role of mediator. Is Russia involved at all in any way?
Russia got involved today. They came out with a really strong statement demanding a ceasefire all of a sudden. I don't know why that happened today. If it's just a cumulative pressure of events and it happened to be today or something else happened, but they came out with a strong statement. They haven't been very actively involved till now. Egypt, yes, they're the go-between. They have been in most of the previous conflicts. The US can't talk to Hamas. Israel doesn't talk to Hamas. So Egypt by default is the player, and they have they have a fair amount of influence over Hamas because they control the border there. But in the end, nobody can exert overwhelming influence on Hamas. Hamas has an agenda, and they're quite determined about it. When they're ready for a ceasefire will happen.
They have requested a ceasefire, have they not, at multiple occasions in the last few days?
I haven't seen a formal statement to that effect. I may have missed it, but I mean, they always do this. They did in 2014. There were multiple requests for ceasefire when things aren't going well from their point of view. And then if there is a ceasefire, sometimes they open fire again. On many occasions they have. Look, the fact that, let's say for argument's sake, that they really are sincere about wanting it this time, does that mean that we have to agree immediately to the timing? Is the ceasefire the ultimate objective? No. The ultimate objective is to prevent these things from happening again. And if we can't prevent it, to at least lengthen the periods of calm between the rounds. That's the objective. Of course, the ultimate objective is to reach peace between Israel and the Palestinians. But okay, that's not going to happen in the immediate future. The objective today is to change the situation. And if Israel needed an extra few days to do it, and possibly still needs another couple of days, that precedes the need for a ceasefire. The ceasefire is a means, it's not an end.
Chuck, you've been a real trooper, and I happen to know that you were teaching until about 2 minutes before we started the session, and I think you've answered between 20 and 30 questions of rapid fire. So let me end with the hardest, but also most speculative. Could you paint for us the most optimistic, most pessimistic, and maybe somewhere in the middle predictions about what the next week or so are going to look like?
The next week or so?
Yeah, or you know, if you like, from now till the end, till now to the end of this round of fighting, depending on levels of optimism.
Look, I mean, obviously, I'm a partisan here. I don't claim to be objective. The optimal outcome would be that Hamas is dealt a devastating military blow. To be realistic, I don't think that's going to happen. That's not the nature of asymmetric war against non-state actors. Even if you succeed in doing it, they never admit to failure, to defeat. But I don't think it's going to happen. And I'm always deeply, deeply concerned about the errant missile. Because in all the previous rounds, I think, or just about all of them, there's always an errant missile or an errant bomb, which caused a lot of civilian casualties. So far, we've actually been pretty lucky. Yes, there have been a few horrors, entire families that were killed. But still, the numbers there are still comparatively small. I'm afraid there's a lot of warfare going on here. And so I'm always afraid that that'll happen. If you want
what's your optimistic scenario?
Well, I said the optimistic scenario is that they're dealt a devastating blow, and then we can go back to peace and quiet. And of course, it would be nice to think that it could then be a basis for renewed peace talks and for reuniting the West Bank with Gaza, because the Palestinians, even if the PA really wants to go ahead, they can't finalize anything because they don't speak for Gaza. They don't speak for the entire Palestinian people anymore. So reunification there is critical. It would be nice if either Mr. Abbas or a successor was willing to engage again and make some of the compromises that the Palestinians have to make. And it would be nice if we could elect a new government for a whole variety of domestic reasons that I outlined in the beginning, and so that we could also get back to serious talks. Optimism is a precious and rare commodity in the Middle East. I don't see a great deal of it at the moment. And I also think that the expectations in the US that the US can do a great deal, at least in the short term, I think they're incorrect. I would advise the Biden administration not to initiate a peace initiative at this point, because it'll fail, and another failed initiative is counterproductive. Maybe in a year or two, if we've got new leaders on both sides, when the administration has their domestic priorities behind them, maybe then we can talk about it. I don't think the timing is right now.
Thank you, Chuck. I prefer sober to unrealistically optimistic any day. And I appreciate the time that you've given us. I appreciate the audience for their active participation. Thank you all for joining yet another conversation from the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies on the Berkeley campus. I'm Ron Hassner. That was Chuck Freilich. Thank you very much, Chuck. I hope you have a very safe and quiet night.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again.